Welcome to my channel of Gill Master Stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon for more inspiration and mind-blowing stories. When a group of rowdy bikers mocked a quiet, old man at a bar, they thought it was just another night of fun. Until the bartender revealed the man's shocking identity. What happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. The bar was alive with noise, glasses clinked, laughter erupted from one side of the room, and the jukebox churned out a rock anthem that had been popular decades ago. It was a typical Friday night at Max's Roadhouse. Just outside Nashville, regulars crowded the long counter, talking over each other about the game, their jobs, or nothing in particular. In the far corner, nearly swallowed by the shadows, sat an old man. He nursed a glass of whiskey, his hand steady despite his age. His back was straight, his gaze focused as if he was studying the liquid, like it held some kind of secret. A battered olive green cap with military insignia rested snugly on his head. It was frayed at the edges, much like the man wearing it, but it carried a quiet dignity. The door swung open, and in came the bikers, 6 of them clad in black leather jackets, adorned with patches and slogans. They were big, loud, and carried an air of mischief that demanded attention. The regulars glanced their way, but quickly returned to their drinks, not wanting to catch their eye. The leader of the pack, a towering man with a thick beard and a laugh that seemed to shake the walls, slapped the bar and ordered a round of beers for his crew. That's when one of them noticed the old man. "Hey, check it out," a younger biker said, nudging his friend. "Grandpa's out past his bedtime." The others chuckled, stealing glances at the man in the corner. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look their way. That only seemed to spur them on. But he doesn't even remember what year it is. Another chimed in loud enough for the whole bar to hear. Still, the old man didn't react. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and placed it back down with deliberate care. The leader smirked and turned to his crew. "Maybe he's one of those war vets," he said mockingly. "What do you think, boys? Want to go pay our respects?" The bartender, a gruff man named Charlie, who had seen more bar fights than he cared to admit, shot them a warning glance. "Leave him alone," he said, his voice firm. "He's not bothering anybody." But the bikers weren't in the mood to listen. They were just getting started. The bikers moved toward the corner, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. As the atmosphere in the bar shifted, all eyes turned to the unfolding confrontation. The room seemed to grow quieter. As the bikers approached, conversations tapered off, and the clinking of glasses faded into the background. The air grew thick with tension. Most of the regulars knew better than to interfere when this group started their antics. Still, a few cast uneasy glances toward the bartender, silently willing him to step in, but Charlie held back, his eyes narrowing as he wiped down the counter, waiting to see how this would play out. The leader, who the others called Tank, stopped a few feet away from the old man's table. He towered over the seated figure, his grin wide and confident. "Hey there, Pops," he said, leaning in just enough to invade the man's space. "That's a nice hat you've got. Military, huh? You see some action back in the day." The old man didn't look up. Instead, he adjusted the brim of his cap and took another sip of his whiskey. His silence only added fuel to the fire. "What's the matter, Tank?" Press louder this time. "Cat got your tongue, or are you just too old to hear me?" One of the younger bikers snickered. "Maybe he's gone deaf, or maybe he's just scared." Finally, the old man set his glass down. He looked up, his gaze meeting Tank's with a calm intensity. That made the biker pause for just a second. "Do you boys need something?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Tank chuckled, though there was an edge of discomfort in it. "Yeah, we need you to lighten up. You're killing the vibe in here, sitting all quiet like that." The old man leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "I'm just enjoying my drink. You should try doing the same." The crowd held its breath. For a moment it seemed like Tank might back off, but his pride wouldn't let him. "You think you're funny, old man," he said, his grin fading. He grabbed the cap off the man's head, holding it high like a trophy. Why don't you tell us what makes you so special? What's this supposed to mean, huh? A murmur ran through the bar. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But no one dared intervene. The old man stood up slowly. His movements deliberate, without the hat. The deep lines on his face seemed even more pronounced. Each one telling a story of time and hardship. "That's not yours," he said, his voice still calm, but with a sharp edge. "Now hand it back." The younger bikers laughed nervously. Unsure of what would happen next, Tank, emboldened by their support, waved the hat around like it was a toy. "Or what, old-timer? You're gonna call your bingo buddies to come back? You up?" The old man didn't blink, he simply stared at Tank. His silence, more commanding than any words could have been. The bartender finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Tank, don't push it. You don't know who you're messing with." But it was too late. Tank's ego had taken the wheel. And he wasn't about to let go, as Tank's laughter echoed through the bar. The old man took a step forward, his presence suddenly seeming much larger than his frame. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. The room felt heavier now, the tension rippling outward. With every second of silence, the old man stood still, his weathered face unreadable. But something in his eyes shifted, a glint of authority, a flicker of something dangerous. For the first time, Tank's grin faltered, if only for a moment. Still, he wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. "Take a seat, old man," Tank said, forcing a laugh to mask his discomfort. He waved the cap again, this time dangling it mockingly in front of the old man. "Like bait. You're not scaring anyone with that tough guy act." The old man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements calm but deliberate, as if sizing Tank up. The noise in the bar had dwindled to nothing now, everyone watching with wide eyes, unsure what was about to unfold. Charlie, the bartender, had stopped polishing glasses. "Tank," he said again, more forcefully this time. "Give it back now." But Tank ignored him, turning his attention back to the man in front of him. "You gotta make me pops, is that it?" The old man's voice was quiet, steady. "I've faced men twice your size, with more bark and sharper teeth," he said, locking eyes with Tank. "You don't scare me, son. But you should be careful who you challenge, you never know who they are." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. One of the younger bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the others for reassurance. The group had come in looking for a good time. But this wasn't the easy prey they'd expected. Tank laughed again, louder, this time, as though he could drown out the uneasy silence that had settled around him. "Look at this guy trying to talk big," he said, turning to his crew. "What do you think? Should I give Grandpa his hat back?" "Yeah, give it back," one of the younger bikers muttered, barely audible. He wasn't smiling anymore. But Tank wasn't ready to let it go. He stepped closer, towering over the old man, and jabbed a finger at his chest. "Tell me, Pops, what makes you so special, you think? Wearing this hat gives you some kind of free pass." The old man didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Tank like he was trying to decide whether he was worth the trouble. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "That hat represents a lifetime of service, something you wouldn't understand." Tank opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Charlie stepped out from behind the bar. He wasn't a small man, and the authority in his stride was enough to make even Tank hesitate. "That's enough," Charlie said, his voice hard as steel. "You're about to cross a line you can't come back from." Tank rolled his eyes, but before he could protest, Charlie added, "You have no idea who this man is, do you?" The room went dead silent. Even Tank froze, his bravado flickering for the first time. Charlie's words cut through the tension like a blade, and all eyes turned to the bartender as he stepped closer, ready to share a truth that would change everything. Charlie stood between the bikers and the old man, his expression dark with warning. "You idiots really don't know who you're messing with," he said, his voice low but sharp. He pointed at the cap Tank still held, now limp in his hand. "That's not just any military hat. That belongs to Lieutenant General Raymond Ray Harris, Vietnam, Gulf War, Black Ops. You're standing in front of one of the most decorated, War heroes this country has ever known. The room seemed to shrink. Under the weight of Charlie's words, the bikers stared at him, blinking as if they hadn't heard correctly. Tank's grin finally slipped away, replaced with a confused scowl. "You're joking," he said. But there was no conviction in his voice. Charlie folded his arms, his gaze unflinching. "I've seen the man on TV. I've read about him in history books. Hell, he's even got a plaque hanging at the VFW down the road. And let me tell you, he's not the kind of man you want to piss off." The old man, General Harris, hadn't moved. He stood quietly, his gaze fixed on Tank, his hands steady at his sides. "Charlie," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't need to do this," but Charlie ignored him. He took a step closer to Tank, his voice growing colder. "This man has seen things you can't even imagine. While you're here playing tough guy, he's fought wars, led men and done things most of us wouldn't survive. If he wanted to, he could take you apart without breaking a sweat." The bikers exchanged nervous glances, even the youngest among them, who had been snickering just moments ago, looked visibly uneasy. Tank swallowed hard, his bravado wavering. But he wasn't ready to let go of his pride. "How do you know he's not just some old guy spinning war stories?" he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "Charlie didn't flinch, because I served under him," he said, his voice like steel. ".20 years ago in the Gulf. He saved my life and a dozen others in a firefight we weren't supposed to make it out of. And trust me, you don't forget a man like that." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on the old man now, who finally stepped forward. Taking back his hat from Tank's trembling hand, he adjusted it carefully, smoothing the worn brim before meeting Tank's gaze. "You've had your fun," General Harris said, his voice calm but firm. "Now sit down. Finish your drinks and let this be the end of it." For a moment it seemed like Tank might argue. His jaw worked and his fists clenched at his sides, but the weight of the room, the eyes of the crowd, the bartender's unflinching stance, and the quiet authority radiating from the old man was too much. Tank stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "No harm done, right?" Harris didn't respond. He simply turned and sat back down, his glass of whiskey waiting for him. But the tension hadn't fully eased, and as the bikers shuffled back to their table, General Harris did something unexpected. He spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. Once more, the old man's voice broke the silence, like a sharp knife cutting through heavy air. "You boys think the world owes you something." General Harris began, his tone steady, but there was a hard edge beneath it. He didn't look at the bikers directly, but his words were meant for them, and everyone in the room knew it. Tank and his crew froze, their beers untouched. The other patrons leaned in slightly, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Even Charlie, who had retreated behind the bar, stopped mid-motion, his eyes locked on Harris. "I've seen men like you before." Harris continued, tilting his glass thoughtfully. "Men who think strength comes from the size of their muscles, or how loud they can shout, but real strength, that's something else entirely." He set his glass down, the clink echoing louder than it should have. "I was 19 when I learned what real strength looks like, fresh out of basic, thrown into the jungles of Vietnam. No amount of training prepares you for that. For the heat, the fear, the noise, or the silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if the next step you take will be your last." The room was silent now, all ears tuned to the old man's words. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "There was this mission, a rescue op. 2 of our guys were pinned down, surrounded by enemy fire. Command told us it was a suicide run, but we went anyway. Not because we wanted to be heroes. No one thinks about medals in moments like that. But because leaving them behind wasn't an option." His eyes grew distant, as if he could still see the jungle in his mind. "We lost 2 men that day, good men, but we brought those boys home. I still see their faces sometimes. Those we lost and those we saved, and every time I do I remind myself that real strength isn't about what you take. It's about what you're willing to give." The bikers sat frozen. Their earlier swagger completely gone, even Tank, who had seemed untouchable just moments ago, was staring at the table, his jaw tight, but his hands trembling slightly. Harris continued, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. I've carried men out of burning vehicles, patched up wounds with my bare hands, and held brothers while they took their last breaths. I fought for this country, for the freedoms you enjoy, without a second thought. And what do you do with that freedom? Come into a bar and harass an old man who's just trying to enjoy a drink. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the bikers. You think that makes you tough? Son, you don't know the first thing about tough. The room was utterly still. Even the jukebox seemed to have gone quiet, its usual hum replaced by a suffocating silence. Harris took a deep breath, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. But his face remained calm, resolute. You don't have to prove you're strong by tearing someone else down, he said finally. Real strength is in lifting others up, even when it costs you something. The weight of Harris's words hung in the air. And for the first time that night, the bikers looked more like boys who'd been caught doing something shameful. The crowd waited, breaths held, to see how they'd respond. The bikers sat motionless, their earlier bravado reduced to an uncomfortable silence. Tank, the leader, who had filled the room with his booming voice and cocky grin, now stared at the table, avoiding Harris's piercing gaze. The other members of the crew fidgeted, shifting in their seats, as if the weight of the old man's words was too much to bear. The crowd watched them closely, their expressions ranging from quiet satisfaction to hesitant concern. Charlie, the bartender, leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting to see how this moment would play out. Finally, Tank broke the silence. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh and awkward in the still room. Aya, he struggled to find words, his usual confidence completely gone. I didn't know, all right. I didn't know who you were. Harris didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at Tank, his calm, unwavering gaze forcing the biker to confront his shame head-on. I mean it, Tank continued, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. We were just messing around. I didn't mean any disrespect. One of the younger bikers, the one who had laughed the loudest earlier, finally spoke up, his voice trembling. We're sorry, sir. We didn't know. Harris leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. You shouldn't need to know someone's story to treat them with respect, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Every person you meet has been through battles you can't see. Some carry those scars on the outside. Others carry them within. Either way, it cost you nothing to show decency. The younger biker nodded quickly, his face red with embarrassment. Yes, sir. You're right. I'm sorry. Tank looked up finally, meeting Harris's eyes. I'm sorry too, he said, the words sounding foreign coming from his mouth. He hesitated, then stood, extending his hand toward the old man. Thank you for your service, and for reminding us what really matters. Harris studied him for a moment, then took the offered hand, his grip firm but not forceful. Apology accepted, he said, but remember this moment. Don't let it fade once you leave this place. Tank nodded, his face solemn. We won't forget, he said, and for the first time, there was sincerity in his voice. The other bikers mumbled their apologies as well, their voices subdued but genuine. The tension in the room began to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. The patrons returned to their conversations, in hushed tones, the weight of the moment lingering, but no longer oppressive. Charlie stepped forward, clapping Tank on the shoulder. Smart move, son, he said gruffly. Now why don't you boys finish your beers and call it a night? The bikers nodded, retreating to their table without another word. They sat quietly, their earlier rowdiness replaced by reflective silence. Harris picked up his whiskey, taking a slow sip as he gazed out the window. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone was enough to leave an indelible mark on everyone in the room. As the night returned to its usual rhythm, the patrons of Mac's Roadhouse were left with a story they'd never forget, and a lesson that would stick with them long after the old man had gone. The night at Max's Roadhouse slowly resumed its usual rhythm, but the air carried a different weight now. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. People glanced toward the corner where General Harris sat, their eyes filled with a mix of awe and gratitude. The bikers remained subdued, their beers untouched, as they exchanged quiet words among themselves. Tank, usually the loudest and most confident, seemed lost in thought. He occasionally glanced toward the old man, his expression unreadable. But it was clear that the encounter had shaken him deeply. General Harris finished his whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light as he set the empty glass down. He stood up, his movements slow but deliberate, and adjusted his cap. The bar's patrons watched him, their gazes filled with unspoken respect. Harris didn't acknowledge the attention. He simply turned to Charlie and gave him a small nod. Charlie nodded back, his gruff exterior softening for a moment. "Take care of yourself, General," he said quietly. Harris turned toward the door, his steps measured and steady. Just as he reached the threshold, he paused and looked over his shoulder. His voice carried across the room, strong but calm. "Remember, respect doesn't cost you anything, but the lack of it might." With that, he pushed the door open and walked out into the cool night, leaving the bar in thoughtful silence. Tank watched him leave, his jaw clenched, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he turned back to his crew. "We've got some work to do," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Can't be the men we were tonight." The younger biker nodded solemnly. "Yeah, we can do better." The rest of the crew murmured their agreement. A quiet but meaningful shift in their attitudes. They weren't the same men who had walked in earlier, and it was clear they wouldn't forget this night anytime soon. Back inside the bar, Charlie picked up Harris's empty glass, holding it for a moment before placing it gently into the sink. "That's the kind of man who reminds you what honor looks like," he said, almost to himself. The patrons slowly returned to their conversations, but the energy in the room was different now. Less rowdy, more reflective. People shared knowing glances, the weight of Harris's words and presence lingering like an invisible reminder. Outside, the old man walked toward his car, the stars shining bright above him. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had spent a lifetime teaching lessons through action, and tonight had been no different. He knew that respect and humility weren't just taught, they were earned, and he hoped the bikers would carry that lesson with them. Stories like these remind us of the power of respect, humility, and the unseen battles others have fought. Share this story if it moved you, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the strength in humanity. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. For more content, please leave your comments and share your experiences. Thank you for being part of Gill Master Stories community. See you soon.